In the year of our Lord 1833, when ancient kingdoms still measured time by harvests, bells, and wars, there stood above the emerald valleys of Wycliffe a lonely stone tower wrapped in climbing roses, where every sunset painted the hills with gold and every whispered legend began with the same impossible name. Travelers crossing the winding roads always slowed their horses when the rose tower appeared upon the ridge. Shepherds removed their caps. Children lowered their voices. Even wandering monks made the sign of the cross before continuing their journey. No one passed the tower without looking toward its highest window, hoping to glimpse the mysterious lady who had not touched the earth in 10 long years. Some believed she had been cursed by forgotten magic. Others insisted grief had stolen her mind. A few whispered she had become a holy woman who spoke only with heaven. The truth belonged to almost no one. Lady Seraphine Wycliffe was 26 years old, with copper-red hair that flowed like autumn fire whenever the evening wind escaped through her window. Her quiet gray-blue eyes carried neither madness nor holiness. They carried memory, and memory had proved far heavier than chains. She had imprisoned herself, not because anyone forced her, because she had made a promise no king could break. The Rose Tower was older than the royal castle itself. Weathered stones, softened by centuries of rain and ivy, rose above the valley like the last witness of another age. White roses climbed its walls each spring, blooming from cracks no gardener could explain, while ivy embraced every corner as though protecting an old secret from the passing centuries. Only one narrow chamber remained inhabited. There, beneath arched windows overlooking endless green hills and the silver river beyond, Seraphine had built a quiet world untouched by courts, politics, or fear. Every morning began the same. She scattered grain across the stone ledge. White doves gathered without hesitation, perching upon her shoulders and wrists as though they had forgotten mankind was ever dangerous. She smiled for them more often than she smiled for herself. When the birds flew away, she carried watering cans to dozens of cracked clay pots arranged around the tower chamber. Roses flourished where nothing should have survived. Crimson, ivory, blush pink, deep amber. Every blossom represented another year she had refused to surrender. Old gardener Thomas, now 71, watched from the gardens below every dawn. His hands had become bent by decades of tending royal grounds, yet each morning he bowed toward the highest window before returning to his work. He was the only servant permitted near the tower, though the king insisted it was merely because no one else possessed the patience to climb its endless spiral stairs. Thomas knew better. Some souls survived only because someone remembered they existed. Inside the chamber, shelves overflowed with books gathered across 10 silent years. Histories rested beside poetry. Maps beside astronomy. Music beside philosophy. Seraphine read with the hunger of someone discovering entire kingdoms she could enter without ever leaving her room. When afternoon sunlight crossed the floor, she lifted her violin. Its melodies drifted through the valley like forgotten prayers. Farmers paused in distant fields. Children stopped chasing one another. Shepherd dogs raised their heads. No one spoke while the music floated across the hills, because every note carried a loneliness too beautiful to interrupt. At night she climbed onto the broad stone windowsill, tucked a blanket around her shoulders, and studied the heavens through an old brass telescope given to her by Sister Agnes years before. She knew the constellations better than she knew the faces of most nobles. Meteor showers delighted her like old friends returning exactly when promised. She filled journals with careful drawings of stars and impossible questions that perhaps only heaven could answer. Yet when she closed those journals, she always reached for another bundle. Letters. Hundreds of them. Neatly tied with faded ribbons. None had ever been delivered. Some were written to her mother. Some to her younger brother Lucien. Others to a future she no longer believed waited beyond the tower walls. Each ended the same way. Inside. Unsaid. Hidden away. King Alistair Vane forbade anyone from speaking of his eldest daughter during court gatherings. Whenever foreign ambassadors asked about the silent tower overlooking the valley, he answered with cold indifference. If she wishes to live like a ghost, he often declared, let her. Queen Margaret lowered her eyes each time those words were spoken. Regret had settled into every line upon her face, though she lacked the courage to challenge the husband whose ambition had once outweighed his compassion. Only Prince Lucien refused to forget. Under moonless skies he occasionally climbed the abandoned servant staircase leading halfway toward the tower. Brother and sister shared tea, books, quiet laughter, and stories of the changing kingdom, never speaking of the night everything had ended because both understood its memory remained alive without being invited into conversation. 10 years earlier, when Seraphine had celebrated only 16 summers, peace had hung by a single thread. Across the northern border ruled Prince Aldrich, a man nearly twice her age whose victories were measured not by conquered castles but by widows left behind. Villages whispered of his temper long before his armies appeared. Servants disappeared after trivial mistakes. Noble women learned to smile through bruises hidden beneath jeweled collars. King Alastair saw only opportunity. A marriage would prevent war. One daughter could purchase peace for thousands. The royal council praised his wisdom. No one asked Seraphine whether peace built upon terror deserved to survive. She remembered standing inside the cathedral while seamstresses adjusted her wedding gown. White silk shimmered beneath candlelight like fresh snow, but every stitch felt heavier than iron. Queen Margaret had reached toward her only once before quietly lowering her hand again, defeated by years of obedience. That silence wounded Seraphine more deeply than any command her father uttered. Long after midnight, while the palace celebrated tomorrow's alliance, Seraphine removed every jewel from her hair, folded the magnificent gown across her bed, dressed herself in an ordinary cream linen dress, gathered her favorite books, violin, telescope, and journals, then walked alone beneath starlight toward the oldest tower on the estate. She entered without looking back. The enormous oak door closed behind her with a sound that echoed through empty stone corridors like the ending of an age. She locked it from within. Then she carried the only iron key to the ancient wishing well beside the tower and dropped it into darkness. By dawn, the kingdom discovered its vanished bride. 10 years had passed since that night. As another golden evening settled across the valley, Seraphine opened her favorite book beside the ivy-covered window. A warm breeze turned its pages before she could touch them. Then something caught her eye below. Fresh wildflowers rested neatly upon the stone beneath her window. Thomas had not climbed the hill that afternoon. Someone else had found the tower. The flowers remained beneath the tower until sunrise. Seraphine stared at them from her window for a long time, unable to decide whether they were an accident, a mistake, or the beginning of something she had promised herself could never happen. Thomas swore by every rose in the royal gardens that he had not placed them there. Sister Agnes simply smiled when Seraphine mentioned the mystery and answered that sometimes kindness arrived without introducing itself. The next evening another gift appeared. Not flowers this time. A beautifully bound book of ancient astronomy rested upon the same weathered stone, wrapped in plain linen and protected from the dew. There was no note, no crest, no signature, only the quiet certainty that someone had climbed the lonely hill for her alone. Seraphine carried the volume inside with trembling hands. Its pages smelled of cedar and old parchment. The margins were untouched, the binding flawless, as though its owner had treasured it before willingly letting it go. She spent the entire night reading beneath candlelight, forgetting for a few precious hours that the world beyond her walls had once frightened her. Far below, another pair of eyes watched the warm glow inside the tower. Duke Rowan Ashcroft guided his black stallion down the winding path without looking back. He was 32, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a commander who had survived enough battles to understand that victory often belonged to patience rather than pride. Soldiers trusted him because he never demanded what he would not give himself. Nobles found him frustrating because he refused to flatter anyone, including kings. Months earlier he had returned from defending the northern frontier after nearly 7 years away from court. He disliked banquets, whispered alliances, and polished lies dressed as diplomacy. Whenever palace obligations became unbearable, he escaped into the countryside under the excuse of inspecting roads, bridges, and border watchtowers. That was how he had first seen her. She had been sitting barefoot upon the broad stone windowsill with an open book resting across her lap. Copper hair glowed beneath the setting sun while white doves perched fearlessly around her shoulders. She had never looked down. The image followed him long after he rode away. He returned the following evening. Then the evening after that. Always at sunset. Always remaining far enough away that she would never feel hunted. He neither called her name nor sought permission to climb the tower. Something inside him understood that walls built by sorrow could not be conquered. They could only be respected until the one behind them chose otherwise. Old gardener Thomas noticed the silent visitor before anyone else. One evening he approached Rowan carrying a basket of pruning shears and freshly cut roses. "You've come again," the old man observed gently. "I have. You never asked to meet her." Rowan smiled faintly. If she wished to meet strangers, she wouldn't have chosen a tower. Thomas studied the Duke's face for several thoughtful moments before nodding once. "Then perhaps you're wiser than most princes I've known." From that day onward the gardener said nothing more, yet neither did he discourage the visits. Weeks drifted quietly into autumn. Every few evenings Rowan left another gift beneath the window. A collection of forgotten poems. Pressed mountain wildflowers gathered during military campaigns. A carved wooden nightingale shaped by an injured soldier. Music copied from monastery archives. Maps of constellations drawn by distant scholars. Each gift disappeared before sunrise. Still no message came in return. Winter winds arrived, carrying silver frost across the valley. One snowy evening Rowan left a thick wool blanket embroidered with tiny stars, believing the old tower must become bitterly cold after sunset. The following morning the blanket was gone. Nothing else changed. Yet everything felt different. Seraphine no longer believed the mysterious visitor was imaginary. She found herself watching the path before opening each new book, wondering if she might glimpse the unknown writer. Whenever she caught herself hoping, guilt quickly followed. Hope had once nearly destroyed her life. She refused to feed it again. One afternoon she reached the final page of another volume Rowan had left behind. Before closing it, she noticed a tiny mistake in one astronomical illustration. Almost without thinking, she corrected the drawing in delicate ink. Then she added a single sentence beside it. The stars above the western valley appear 2 days earlier each autumn. She hesitated, closed the book, wrapped it carefully. Before sunrise Thomas discovered it resting exactly where the mysterious gifts always appeared. He quietly carried it to the waiting Duke without asking questions. Rowan opened the book beneath an ancient oak tree. The elegant handwriting stole his breath. No signature. Only one thoughtful correction. He laughed softly, the sound startling his horse. The next evening he returned the same volume. Beneath her note he had written, "I stand corrected. Perhaps the valley keeps secrets unknown to wandering soldiers." Seraphine stared at the unfamiliar reply for a very long time. Then she smiled despite herself. Not because of the compliment. Because whoever waited below had answered without demanding anything in return. Their correspondence grew slowly. One question. One answer. One margin at a time. They debated poetry. Argued gently over philosophers. Compared different maps of the heavens. Recommended forgotten histories. Sometimes weeks passed between replies. Neither hurried the other. Neither asked a single personal question. Names remained unnecessary. Faces remained uncertain. Only handwriting became familiar. Spring returned, and with it came evenings fragrant with blooming roses. Rowan often sat beneath an old elm overlooking the tower, reading the same books she held above. Occasionally the faint melody of her violin drifted down through the warm air. He never applauded. He simply listened until the final note dissolved into birdsong. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, Rowan's wise grandmother, eventually noticed his unexplained disappearances. When he finally confessed that an unknown woman had become the brightest part of every sunset, the elderly lady poured him another cup of tea and regarded him with amused affection. "Tell me," she asked, "have you kissed her?" "No." "Held her hand?" "No." "Spoken with her?" "Not once." Lady Eleanor smiled. "Then you've fallen in love with her soul before ever seeing whether the world approves of her face. Few people are granted such a blessing." Her words lingered in Rowan's thoughts for many days. Summer painted the valley emerald once more. One golden evening, as Rowan prepared to leave another bundle of wildflowers beneath the tower, he sensed movement high above. Slowly, almost cautiously, Seraphine lifted her eyes from her book. For the first time in 10 years, she looked directly at the man who had waited beneath her window. Neither smiled. Neither waved. The silence between them somehow became richer than conversation. Then, before Rowan could lower his gaze in gratitude, another figure emerged from the trees beyond the tower path, watching them both with narrowed eyes. Lady Helena Ravenshire had discovered the secret. Lady Helena Ravenshire did not believe in coincidences. From the shadows of the oak grove she watched the silent exchange between the Duke and the woman in the tower, and jealousy settled over her heart like winter frost creeping across glass. She had spent 2 years expecting Rowan Ashcroft to choose her. Noble families approved of the match. Court ladies spoke of it as though it were already arranged. Yet the man she intended to marry had never looked at her with the quiet wonder now written across his face. She looked upward. The woman disappeared from the window. Helena looked back toward Rowan. He gently placed another bouquet of wild roses upon the familiar stone before riding away without noticing he had been followed. The next morning whispers began their long journey through the palace. Servants repeated them while polishing silver. Ladies embroidered them into conversations over tea. Courtiers carried them from one marble hallway to another until rumor sounded almost identical to truth. The Duke rides to the haunted tower every evening. They say the princess has bewitched him. No woman hides herself for 10 years unless madness has already claimed her. Each retelling grew crueler than the last. Rowan ignored every word. He had spent enough years on battlefields to know that fear always shouted louder than courage. The valley below the tower remained peaceful, and that peace mattered more than every voice inside the royal court. Seraphine heard none of the gossip. Her world remained measured by sunrise, books, violin strings, and the appearance of carefully chosen gifts beneath her window. Their written conversations continued, filling the margins of forgotten volumes with observations about distant constellations, poems neither admitted had moved them, and questions whose answers slowly revealed the shape of two lonely hearts. One evening Rowan wrote, "Do you believe a person can spend years hiding and still remain brave?" When the book returned 3 days later, her reply waited beneath his question. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Sometimes it is simply surviving another sunrise. He read the sentence again and again before quietly closing the book against his chest. Far away inside the palace, Lady Helena carried a very different story to King Alastair Vane. She found him alone inside the council chamber studying maps of neighboring kingdoms. With graceful courtesy she bowed. "Your Majesty, forgive my boldness, but I fear someone is dishonoring your family." The king slowly raised his eyes. "What do you mean?" She hesitated just long enough to appear reluctant. "Duke Rowan visits the Rose Tower almost every evening." Silence settled heavily across the chamber. The people have begun talking. King Alastair's expression hardened into stone. "My daughter surrendered her place in this kingdom 10 years ago. Unfortunately, Your Majesty, the kingdom has not surrendered its curiosity." The king dismissed Helena, but anger lingered after she left. That same afternoon Rowan received a royal summons. He entered the throne room still wearing his dark riding coat, dust clinging to his boots from another journey through the countryside. He bowed respectfully, though not deeply enough to flatter. King Alastair descended the marble steps until only a few feet separated them. "I hear you have developed an unusual habit. I ride wherever the roads require inspection. You know exactly which road I mean." Rowan remained silent. "The Rose Tower." Still he offered no excuse. "You will never return there." The command echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Several ministers watched eagerly, waiting to see whether the famous commander would finally bend before royal authority. Instead Rowan answered with calm honesty. "You command my service, Your Majesty." The king folded his hands behind his back. "And? You command my sword." "And? My conscience has never belonged to any throne." The room became perfectly still. King Alastair's jaw tightened. "You test my patience." "No," Rowan replied quietly. "Only its purpose." He bowed once more before leaving the throne room, neither victorious nor defeated. Word of the confrontation spread throughout the kingdom before sunset. Some called Rowan reckless. Others called him honorable. Only old Gardener Thomas smiled when he saw the familiar black horse climbing the hill that evening. "You were ordered not to come," the old man observed. "I know. And yet here you are." "Some promises are made without speaking." Thomas nodded as though that answer explained everything. Summer ripened into the season of harvest, and preparations began for the great festival of lanterns, the kingdom's oldest celebration. Every village decorated streets with ribbons. Bakers worked through the night. Children practiced songs while craftsmen carved thousands of wooden lanterns that would float across the river after sunset. The palace glittered with excitement. Only one place remained dark: the Rose Tower. As twilight deepened, Seraphine listened to distant laughter drifting across the valley. Fireworks burst beyond the hills, briefly coloring the clouds with crimson and gold before fading into silence. She told herself she no longer missed celebrations. Loneliness answered before pride could. Far below, Rowan stood beside the river with Sir Gideon Hale and several villagers carrying lanterns of every color imaginable. Gideon looked toward his friend. "Are you certain?" Rowan smiled. "Hope deserves witnesses." Together they lit the first lantern. Then another. Then another. Soon hundreds of glowing lights floated upward, lifted by warm evening air instead of water. Each lantern carried a handwritten message gathered secretly from ordinary people across the kingdom. "Thank you. You helped my family. You reminded me to keep believing. You gave us courage." None bore signatures. They drifted silently toward the lonely tower until golden lights surrounded its highest window like gentle stars descending from heaven. Seraphine stepped onto the stone ledge, astonishment softening every guarded line upon her face. Tears shimmered within her eyes as lantern after lantern filled the valley with warm light. She understood none of it, yet somehow every glowing message reached the emptiness she had hidden for 10 years. Without realizing it, she smiled. It was small, fragile, beautiful enough that Thomas quietly wiped his eyes. Rowan looked upward just once before lowering his gaze again, unwilling to steal the moment from her. Autumn yielded to winter with relentless storms. One bitter evening, heavy snow trapped Rowan's horse beneath the hill leading to the tower. Wind roared through the valley, erasing every path beneath deep drifts. Gideon urged him to return before darkness swallowed the road. Rowan merely wrapped his cloak tighter. "I'll wait until morning." He settled against the ancient stone wall beneath the window, shielding the horse as best he could from the blizzard. Hours passed. Above him a single candle remained burning. Just before dawn, something slowly descended from the tower on a sturdy rope. A thick wool blanket. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. A steaming pot of herb tea. No note accompanied them. No voice called through the storm. Rowan smiled toward the silent window. When morning sunlight finally pierced the clouds, he carefully untied the rope and discovered one more thing fastened beneath the basket. A worn leather journal. Across its first page, written in Seraphine's elegant hand, appeared 5 haunting words. "This is why I disappeared." Rowan carried the worn leather journal home as though it were a sacred relic. He waited until midnight before opening its weathered cover, unwilling to rush words that had remained hidden from the world for 10 years. Candlelight flickered across elegant handwriting that never pleaded for pity. Instead, every page spoke with remarkable calm, as though its author had long ago accepted wounds that still refused to heal. The first entry described a frightened 16-year-old girl standing before a wedding gown she could not bear to wear. The second told of hearing servants whisper that peace was worth any sacrifice, especially when the sacrifice belonged to someone else. Another page held only a single sentence. "No kingdom built upon a woman's broken will can ever truly know peace." Rowan closed the journal for several moments, unable to steady the anger rising within him. She had never hidden because she feared life. She had hidden because every path offered to her led toward losing herself. The following afternoon, Prince Lucien secretly entered Rowan's estate through a side gate rarely used by visitors. His face, once youthful and hopeful, had grown shadowed by years spent watching his family slowly destroy itself. "You know now," Lucien said quietly. "I do. And you understand why she never came down." Rowan nodded. "I understand why she climbed." The prince looked toward the distant hills where the Rose Tower stood against the winter sky. "I've spent 10 years hoping someone would see my sister before seeing the legend. I never saw the legend." Lucien smiled sadly. "No. That's why she trusted you with the journal." Their conversation ended when royal trumpets echoed across the capital. Messengers galloped through every marketplace carrying crimson banners marked with the king's seal. Bells rang urgently from church towers, calling nobles and merchants alike into public squares. The neighboring kingdom had crowned a new ruler. Prince Aldrich was dead. His younger brother, King Magnus, now claimed every treaty signed by the previous generation remained binding, including the marriage agreement. If Lady Seraphine refused to become his queen, the northern armies would march before spring. Fear swept across the kingdom faster than winter winds. The royal council gathered before sunset. Generals argued for war. Merchants begged for compromise. Advisors searched desperately for forgotten loopholes within ancient agreements. King Alistair listened until silence returned. Then he spoke the words that froze every heart in the chamber. "Bring my daughter down." No one answered. The king continued. "If the tower refuses to surrender her." His voice remained perfectly steady. "Tear the tower down." Queen Margaret gasped softly. Prince Lucien rose from his chair. "You cannot mean that." "I mean precisely what I have said. She is your daughter. I am her king." Lucien's hands tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Then today you choose the throne over your child once again." Without waiting for permission, he left the chamber. Queen Margaret followed moments later, tears already filling her eyes. By dawn, hundreds of laborers arrived beneath the Rose Tower carrying ropes, ladders, chisels, and heavy wooden hammers. Soldiers surrounded the hill, not because they expected battle, but because they feared grief could become more dangerous than swords. Inside the tower, Seraphine heard the first blow against ancient stone. Dust drifted gently from the ceiling. She closed her book, walked toward the window, looked down upon the crowd gathering below. She felt no panic, only a familiar sadness. The world still believed force could accomplish what kindness never attempted. Thomas climbed the narrow staircase carrying fresh bread and a small basket of roses. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You have nothing to apologize for. They're going to destroy everything." Seraphine gently placed one weathered hand between both of his. "No." Thomas looked at her in confusion. "They may destroy stones," she answered softly. "They cannot destroy the years we lived inside them." Meanwhile, Rowan rode harder than he had during any battle. News of the king's command reached him before sunrise. Sir Gideon struggled to keep pace. "We only have 200 men nearby. I don't need soldiers." "Then what are you planning?" Rowan's answer surprised even himself. "I'm asking the kingdom to remember." He stopped first in a farming village where an elderly widow recognized him immediately. "They're tearing down the Rose Tower," Rowan announced. The old woman's face turned pale. "The lady who sent medicine after my husband died?" Rowan stared. "You knew?" "I never knew her name. She disappeared inside her cottage and emerged carrying a walking stick." "I'm coming." At the next village a blacksmith removed his leather apron. "Was she the one who paid for my apprentice after the fire?" A schoolteacher lowered her books. "The anonymous lady who bought winter coats for my students?" An orphan girl whispered through tears. "The woman who sent me storybooks every birthday?" Every answer was the same. No one knew who their mysterious benefactor had been. Until now. Village after village emptied. Farmers abandoned plows. Bakers left warm bread cooling upon tables. Midwives closed their doors. Old veterans leaned upon canes. Children insisted on coming despite their parents' worries. They did not march behind banners. They walked together carrying flowers, blankets, candles, books, baskets of bread, and simple acts of gratitude. By afternoon thousands filled the valley beneath the tower. Soldiers shifted uneasily. They had expected angry rebels. Instead they faced ordinary people standing shoulder to shoulder in complete silence. King Alistair arrived surrounded by mounted guards. His horse slowed as he looked upon the impossible gathering. "What is the meaning of this?" No one answered. Instead Thomas stepped forward holding a small wooden chest. With trembling hands he opened it before the king. Inside lay hundreds of neatly folded letters. Receipts. Lists of names. Sketches. Records stretching back 10 years. "I kept them," the gardener said quietly. "She asked me never to tell anyone." The king frowned. "What are they?" "The lives she changed." Thomas lifted the first letter. "A widow whose children survived winter because food arrived without explanation." Another. "A boy whose education continued because anonymous coins appeared each spring." Another. "A crippled soldier whose medicine was paid for every month." Another. "A monastery rebuilt after lightning destroyed its roof." The old man looked directly into the king's eyes. "Every kindness came from your daughter." Murmurs swept through the valley. People began recognizing their own names among the records. One by one they stepped forward, tears replacing disbelief. The soldiers slowly lowered their spears. Queen Margaret arrived moments later, pushing through the crowd until she stood before the tower. Her voice broke as she looked upward. "Seraphine." The tower window opened. Mother and daughter saw one another clearly for the first time in years. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Then Rowan rode through the silent crowd, dismounted before the king, removed his sword, and laid it carefully upon the frozen ground. "If a hostage is required to prevent this war," he declared, his voice carrying across the valley, "take me instead." Gasps echoed from every side. King Alistair stared at him in disbelief. "You would surrender your freedom?" Rowan never looked away from the tower window. "Before I watch her stolen again." Silence followed. Then from somewhere deep inside the ancient Rose Tower, a heavy iron lock turned. Once, twice. The great oak door, unopened for 10 long years, began to slowly swing inward. The ancient oak door groaned open with a sound that seemed to awaken every memory sleeping inside the valley. No one breathed. Even the winter wind grew strangely still, as though the kingdom itself feared breaking the fragile miracle unfolding before its eyes. A single figure appeared within the shadowed doorway. Lady Seraphine Wycliffe stepped into the pale afternoon sunlight. For 10 years she had belonged to silence. Now silence belonged to her. Her copper-red hair flowed freely over a simple cream dress that carried none of the jewels or embroidery expected of a princess. Time had refined rather than diminished her beauty. Her face held quiet wisdom instead of youthful innocence, while her gentle gray-blue eyes reflected both immeasurable sorrow and astonishing peace. The crowd instinctively lowered their heads. Nobody had prepared themselves for the reality that the forgotten princess still existed. She rested one hand against the ancient stone wall that had sheltered her for a decade before slowly descending the worn staircase leading toward the earth she had not touched since she was 16 years old. Each step echoed across the valley, not loudly, but with the weight of history. Halfway down she paused. Her bare feet hovered above the final stone. Grass swayed gently beneath the winter sunlight. She closed her eyes. For 10 years she had imagined this moment. She had wondered whether the world would feel different, whether the earth would still welcome someone who had abandoned it, whether she deserved to belong anywhere beyond the tower. Then, with remarkable tenderness, she lowered one trembling foot onto the soft green grass. Warmth traveled upward through her body. She opened her eyes. Tears escaped without permission. Not tears of grief, not even relief, only gratitude that the world had continued waiting for her. No trumpet sounded. No cheer erupted. The silence itself became the greatest celebration. Seraphine slowly began walking. The gathered soldiers instinctively stepped aside. Farmers removed worn hats. Children stared with wide, wondering eyes. Old women quietly crossed themselves. Every person she passed seemed less interested in seeing a princess than witnessing hope itself take human form. King Alistair stood rigid beside his horse, his royal cloak stirring in the cold breeze. The confidence that had ruled kingdoms now appeared strangely fragile beneath his daughter's calm gaze. She approached him, stopped only a few steps away. Father and daughter looked at one another for the first time in 10 years. His lips parted. No words emerged. For perhaps the first time in his reign, power offered him no language. Seraphine inclined her head politely, neither accusing nor forgiving, then continued walking without another glance. The king watched her pass. His shoulders lowered beneath a burden no crown could lift. Queen Margaret stood weeping openly. Unlike her husband, she made no attempt to preserve dignity before the crowd. "My daughter." The words broke apart as she reached toward Seraphine. This time there was no hesitation. No fearful silence. Only a mother begging heaven for another chance. Seraphine stepped forward and embraced her. Years of restrained sorrow dissolved between them. Margaret buried her face against her daughter's shoulder. "I should have protected you." "You should have," Seraphine answered gently. "I was afraid." "I know. I've asked God every day to forgive me." Seraphine rested a hand upon her mother's hair. "I forgave you long ago." The queen collapsed into quiet sobs while the surrounding crowd wiped away tears of their own. Prince Lucian approached next. Unlike the others, he simply smiled. "I told you the stars were still waiting." She laughed softly through her tears. "And you were right." He wrapped both arms around his sister. "I never stopped believing." "Neither did I." "Then why did you stay so long?" She looked toward the ancient tower. "I had to learn that hiding and healing are not the same thing." Lucian nodded slowly. Only then did Seraphine continue walking. Everyone believed she was finally moving toward Rowan. Instead she passed him. A murmur of surprise swept through the valley. Rowan never reached for her. Never called her name. He simply watched with quiet understanding. Love that had waited years could certainly wait another few moments. Seraphine crossed the crowd until she reached old gardener Thomas. The elderly man immediately attempted to bow. Before he could, she gently stopped him. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she knelt upon the frozen grass before the old gardener. Her fingers closed around his weathered hands. Hands roughened by decades of honest work. Hands that had carried food up endless stairs. Hands that had delivered medicine, books, blankets, and hope to strangers without ever seeking recognition. She lifted those worn hands to her forehead. "Everyone called me brave," she whispered. "But you climbed those stairs every day." Thomas's eyes overflowed. "I only brought bread. You brought tomorrow. You gave the kindness. You carried it." The old gardener shook his head through tears. "I never wanted you to be alone. I never was." She looked up at him with a smile brighter than the winter sun. "I always knew someone would knock tomorrow." The valley broke into quiet weeping. Even hardened soldiers lowered their faces. The greatest hero of the kingdom had never worn armor. He had simply carried baskets. Seraphine finally rose and turned toward Rowan. He still stood exactly where she had first passed him. Sword lying untouched upon the ground. Hands empty. Expression peaceful. No demand lingered within his eyes. Only patience. She walked slowly until only a few feet separated them. "You read every page." "I did." "You know everything." "I know enough." "What do you know?" Rowan smiled faintly. I know a frightened girl climbed into a tower. He paused. A remarkable woman walked out. Seraphine lowered her eyes. I am still afraid. I know. What if I disappoint everyone? You already haven't. What if one day I wish to hide again? Then I'll wait outside your window. A soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. What if I never become the woman the kingdom expects? His answer came without hesitation. I've never loved the kingdom's expectations. She looked directly into his eyes. For years they had spoken through books. Now words suddenly felt too small. You never tried to rescue me. Because you never needed rescuing. You waited. Because I hoped one day you would choose the world again. He took one careful step forward. No throne asked me to. No law demanded it. No promise required it. I simply believed the woman who loved stars deserved to see another sunrise outside those walls. Silence wrapped gently around them. Then Seraphine reached for his hand. The gesture was almost impossibly small. Yet the valley erupted into applause that echoed against distant mountains. Not because a prince had claimed a princess, but because a woman had made her own choice. King Alistair slowly approached them. He no longer resembled an untouchable monarch. Only an aging father carrying unbearable regret. He removed the royal crown from his head. I failed my daughter. No one interrupted. I believed fear could preserve kingdoms. He looked across the gathered people. But kindness has accomplished what power never could. Turning toward Prince Lucien, he placed the crown into his son's hands. The throne deserves someone who understands the difference. Lucien accepted it with tears shining in his eyes. Queen Margaret quietly rested a hand upon her husband's shoulder. For the first time in many years, the royal family stood together without pretending perfection. Months later, when spring covered the valley with roses once again, no cathedral hosted the wedding. Seraphine refused every jeweled hall. Instead she chose the meadow beside the rose tower. Wildflowers decorated simple wooden benches. Village children scattered rose petals gathered from the tower gardens. Thomas walked beside Seraphine as proudly as any father. Sister Agnes offered the blessing. Lady Eleanor embraced the bride before placing an old family ring into Rowan's hand. When Rowan and Seraphine exchanged vows, they promised neither obedience nor ownership. Only companionship. To walk beside one another. Never ahead. Never behind. Always together. After the celebration, Seraphine made one final request before the gathered kingdom. The Rose Tower would never again belong to royalty. Its doors would remain forever open. Any woman fleeing forced marriage, cruelty, abandonment, or despair could seek shelter there without fear of questions or judgment. Books would fill its rooms. Teachers would guide its halls. Gardens would bloom around its walls. No woman entering would be called weak. Only welcome. People soon stopped calling it the Rose Tower. Across neighboring kingdoms it became known by another name. The House of Second Chances. Years passed. Children's laughter echoed where lonely violin melodies had once drifted through empty air. Windows that had watched silence now overlooked gardens filled with families rebuilding broken lives. Every evening, as the sun painted the valley with familiar shades of gold, Rowan and Seraphine climbed together to the same ivy-covered window where everything had begun. She still loved reading aloud while he listened with quiet contentment. Sometimes they watched white doves circle the ancient stones before settling upon the roof. Sometimes they counted the first evening stars. Sometimes they spoke no words at all. Travelers crossing the valley still slowed their horses beneath the old tower. Parents pointed toward the window while telling children the legend. They never spoke first about kings, wars, or crowns. Instead they told of a woman who refused to surrender her soul, and of a man who discovered that the strongest love is not the one that breaks down walls, but the one patient enough to wait outside them until the person within is finally ready to open the door herself.